Okay, so the budget has a big focus on housing. That appears to be the big theme. But what's the impact and what's missing? Joining us live tonight, our CP24 Tonight political panel, former MP and Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Lisa Raitt, former federal NDP leader and CTV News political commentator Tom Mulcair, and former senior advisor to Prime Minister Paul Martin, Scott Reid, who is also a CTV News political commentator. Quite the panel. A lot to share in terms of all of your titles. Thanks so much. So we have some time to chat with you about the budget today. First of all, my first question, and this is something I just asked CTV's Glenn McGregor. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland said this is a realistic budget. You won't, here in Toronto, you're not going to wave a wand and be able to buy a home in the neighborhood that you want to live in. The idea is to break barriers to increase housing supply, she says. Does this budget break barriers to increase supply? I'll start with you, Scott.
I think it could. What I like about the housing plan is that it recognizes that this is a super complex problem. It challenges governments at every level. It challenges individual behavior, the market, all of that. So it's going to take a lot of different moving pieces to try to make progress. So I like that it's a plan with a lot of elements. What I guess I question is whether all of those elements will necessarily be effective. So I look at something like $4 billion to incentivize rezoning and permitting, effectively to try to fight NIMBYism and encourage quick supply movement at the municipal level. And I wonder, wow, where does that $4 billion go? What exactly does it purchase and where and when? So I got big questions around things like that. But in general terms, I think at least the government is signaling that as a federal government, it recognizes that there is a national imperative to do something about housing and the affordability of homes for individual families.
And of course, a lot of this falls to the provinces and also the municipalities too. Lisa, so what do you think? Is this a realistic and a suitable plan to break barriers, particularly for young people in this country?
I'll agree with Scott. It only works if the provinces, the federal government, and municipalities work with one another. And I'll give you an example. In the budget this week, actually for Nova Scotia, there was a bold move made where Premier Houston has indicated that should an out-of-province owner in a house in Nova Scotia essentially an out-of-province owner of a house in Nova Scotia is going to end up paying 200% more in property taxes than they did the day before this new rule came into play. Wow. That combined with the stuff that is happening at the federal level, what's happening at municipal levels, perhaps, but you need coordination on all of this. And the minister who is going to be in charge will have a very great task on their hands to make sure that there's not duplication of efforts, that they're not working cross purposes, so that when you're spending this kind of money, it's actually going to the things that it needs to go to in order to ensure that we're doing what we can to get people into houses at the same time, not in a false kind of way.
Yeah, Tom, what do you think? This is not certainly not a speedy plan. You can't implement or you can't build homes as quickly as you can implement a dental care plan. So what do you think? Also hear this number, 100,000 homes in 5 years. I ran out of time to get into detail with CTV's Glenn McGregor about this, but where are all these homes going? Can they be built that quickly that we're going to have 100,000 homes in this country built, ready to move in 5 years?
No.
Okay.
And this is a promise that comes out of a focus group. The Liberals are very good at decoding what's on people's minds. And owning your own home, let's face it, that's part of the Canadian dream. You work hard. A lot of people of my generation were able to buy homes. Now we're looking at our kids and their grandchildren and saying, will they ever be able to own a home? So they're trying to target that. But I like Glenn McGregor's expression about the law of unintended consequences, because, Christina, one of the things that we're going to be doing here by creating this sort of hybrid RRSP and TFSA for homes is we're going to be putting more money into the market. And when you do that, it can have an inflationary effect on prices. So you've got to be very careful. But it's well intended. The part that produced the greatest smiles here in Quebec was the idea that the bureaucrats in Ottawa were going to come and give lessons in small towns as to how to issue building permits, because of course there's such an effective and efficient bureaucracy. They have lots of lecturing to do to everybody else across Canada.
And
that has produced smiles across the board here in La Belle Province, I have to tell you.
And here in Ontario, the provincial government also just announced last week to move forward with legislation to eliminate red tape here. But again, a lot of this falls on the municipalities as well. Tom, I'm going to stay with you for just a moment. As the former NDP leader, this pharmacare plan, we recognize part of the deal was that happened by 2023. But why was this not more of a priority in a pandemic? I spoke to the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, about this. I mean, why do we have to make dental care a priority over pharmacare?
Well, that's what they were able to negotiate. If you look at the deal between the NDP and the Liberals, most of the wording is aspirational, very conditional. We'll try to continue working to develop a plan to do this or that. One of the very few specific things was dental care insurance plan in place by December of this year. So there's no fooling around about that. The deal hinges on it. With regard to the pharmacare piece, the Liberals have been talking about it for years, since Mr. Trudeau got there, but they were talking about it for mandate after mandate before that. It's complicated. Some provinces have got pretty complete systems. Most don't. But before this thing is up and running, Mr. Trudeau has lots of time to finish out this mandate, if indeed he does. But one of the signals I got, Christina, from today's exercise was Chrystia Freeland's really getting ready to replace Justin Trudeau.
And of course, that's been clear for some time. But thank you for saying that, Tom. Scott, Lisa, over to you. We'll go back to Scott for a moment. What holes do you see here or deficiencies in this budget?
Well, I mean, I think that this budget actually is quite a bit about what it is not. So I don't think it is the fiscal nightmare that some people feared. I think even some of the government's own preconditioning and spin that told us about how much they were spending in what areas, it actually tended to be exaggerated. So if you take a look at the actual financial commitments, it's not as overwhelming as you might have feared or critics might have feared. On the other hand, it's also not as effective when it comes to tackling affordability, cost of living issues, and certainly in terms of economic growth. Lisa will have more to say about this. This is a bugbear of hers, I know. But it's not the growth plan and it's not the affordability plan that the government wants to assert. So where do I think the deficiencies are? I mean, really, when it comes to growth, they're more or less saying we're spending on the things we said we would spend on anyway. But now we're saying that the consequence of that spending is that it will provoke growth. It may. It may also provoke inefficient outcomes. It may provoke, increased stimulus in the economy that, further feeds inflation. And I don't see a ton here that really takes dead aim at cost of living. And that's going to be the top political issue for the next 2 years. Yeah,
Lisa, we'll get your take. Of course, when we look at cost of living, affordability, inflation, I mean, you're from the GTA. Here in Toronto, life just gets more expensive every year. Since I was a university student here, life has not become more affordable, and that's to be expected over time. I met a woman yesterday when we spoke to her about the federal government's anticipated housing announcement. She said, well, I rent here in Toronto, and it's true, most people do, according to the numbers. She said, what does this do for my $1,600 a month rent? Some of that is, of course, a provincial issue as well, but what do you take on this? What's your take in terms of the deficiencies?
Well, it's funny. I'm going to say something I never thought I'd say on television. I agree with Scott Reid. And the reality is that he is correct in his assessment, and my assessment is the same, that while there seems to be almost a scattergun approach to making sure there's money and all the things that make sense, in housing, affordability, there's money for critical minerals, there's money for innovation. There's no large, grand plan about how we're going to grow the economy to ensure that we can pay for the things that we're putting in place on the long term. One of the biggest surprises to me was how affordable the dental care piece was. I was actually surprised that the number was as low as it was. I mean, I know it's in the billions, but still, it's a lot lower than I thought it was going to be. But that being said, you're going to have economic growth to continue to be able to pay for these programs and to pay for these new aspirational items that we wish to put into place in the coming years. And while I can see elements of a plan, I don't see a call to action and an urgency that we really need to be having at this point in time to ensure that well into the next 10, 20 years, that we are going to be prosperous. And the time is now. to start laying down these kinds of markers and pillars and giving us an understanding of what we have to do as a country together, other than waiting to say, well, what's in it for me this time? That's not the way to approach budgets right now. It has to be about the big picture.
And that is what the average person, thinks, what's in it for me. And that's why sometimes I think members of the public look for some of those, affordability, some of those key words about how life will become more affordable for them when, as you acknowledge, for the federal government, there has to be an element of the big picture here. Tom, with the time we have left, I want to ask you about, Lisa mentioned, urgency, the time is now. And there is no question that when it comes to the environment and climate change, it was quite clear in the last week in the IPCC report that, countries around the world are failing this planet when it comes to climate change. It's been called a file of shame. So we know when we spoke to NDP leader Jagmeet Singh in this show, he can't support the government on that end. But why is this something that the Deputy Prime Minister and the Finance Minister needs help from others, needs help from the private sector to make possible? Why is this such a challenging file? It's not a new problem either.
One of the things we see in the budget is the numbers are not quite as bad as they were just a few months ago, and that's thanks to the petroleum sector. So what we saw this week was an acknowledgement of that, because we've got an environment minister who's got a lot of experience and knowledge and credibility saying that he's going to be pumping green oil from the ocean floor. And he's going to try to make us believe that this is going to be a net zero in terms of greenhouse gases. This is a net zero petroleum project, which of course makes no sense. Now, Antonio Guterres this week, as you were saying, in the wake of that IPCC report, said, look, countries have got to stop faking it. But we're the grand fakers when it comes to sustainable development and climate change. Mr. Trudeau, I was in the room in 2015. Mr. Trudeau threw out his arms and said, Canada is back. Everybody took that to mean we'd start assuming and respecting our international obligations. Instead, under Mr. Trudeau, we had the worst record in the G7. Now, Mr. Singh saying now that he's embarrassed by that, and he should be, has to remember that he's supporting that government, and that was his own choice to spend the next 3.5 years backing up that sort of broken promise.
And can I just say, Tom, I think that's what something people are perplexed by. If the climate issue and the environment is such an important priority for the NDP is propping up this Liberal government. Minister Freeland said today she needs at least $100 billion more in annual investments to reach the federal goal of a net zero economy by 2050. So this is just not going to happen.
No, I attended my first conference under the Kyoto Accord in Milan in 2003 when I was environment minister in Quebec. And back then, they were already playing the game of kicking the can forward a few years. So, without putting too fine a point on it, I don't have a lot to worry about what happens in 2050, but my grandchildren do. And this is the whole responsibility that's being lost here. It's a responsibility to think of future generations every time the government takes a decision that affects the economy, that affects the environment, or that affects social issues. This is this long-term thinking that's sorely lacking. So we're right back to square one in Canada. They can try to sell this as green oil or as an environmentally friendly petroleum project, but you know what? Nobody in the world believes that, and nobody who knows anything about the environment in Canada believes that either.
Okay, that's all the time we have. I could chat with you three about a lot of these topics all night. Lisa, Scott, and Tom, thank you so much. And Lisa, before we go, Christina, we covered on this show recently the W5 special, which when you shared with us, of course, your husband, Bruce, and thank you for being so open and honest about the challenges in your family. Certainly, many people have been touched by that. So thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Christine.
Okay.